It was the summer of 2015, in a quaint little town tucked away in the Midwest, a place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets didn't stay hidden for long. The kind of place where you'd find neighbors peeking over their fences, pretending to trim the hedges while eavesdropping on your conversations. In this provocative story, Rachel, feeling unfulfilled in her marriage to the dependable David, begins an affair with her former lover, Eric. Her emotional detachment and secrecy lead to a slow unraveling of her once stable relationship with David, who is left reeling from the betrayal. As Rachel justifies her actions, the consequences of her infidelity begin to take a devastating toll on both her and David. The narrative confronts the anger and frustration surrounding Rachel's selfish decisions, exposing the raw pain and emotional devastation caused by her unfaithfulness. It's here that our story begins, with our protagonist, Rachel, a 34-year-old graphic designer and self-proclaimed queen of keeping it together. Rachel had a life that, at first glance, seemed picture-perfect. She was married to David, her high school sweetheart, who now ran a successful landscaping business. Together, they lived in a cozy two-story house with a wraparound porch and a golden retriever named Max. You know, the kind of life that makes you think, wow, they've got it all figured out. But like every small-town story, things weren't quite as perfect as they seemed. Rachel was the type of person who could light up a room with her laugh but often hid her struggles behind a mask of humor. She had a habit of cracking jokes at the most inappropriate times, a defense mechanism, no doubt, but it made her charming in an awkward, endearing sort of way. Her husband David was her opposite in many ways, reserved, practical, and steady as a rock. The kind of guy who thought buying flowers for your wife was a waste of money because they just die anyway. Their relationship was stable, or at least that's how it appeared to outsiders, but Rachel often found herself feeling restless, yearning for something she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't that David was a bad husband. He wasn't. He was kind and hard-working, and he loved her in his quiet, unassuming way. But sometimes, Rachel wondered if that was enough. One particularly sweltering afternoon in July, Rachel found herself sitting on the porch, sipping iced tea and scrolling through her phone. David was out back, mowing the lawn, his shirt soaked with sweat. It was a routine they'd fallen into. She'd watch, he'd work. They didn't talk much these days, at least not about anything meaningful. The silence between them had grown comfortable, like an old sweater you forget you're wearing. As Rachel scrolled mindlessly through social media, she came across a friend request from someone she hadn't seen in over a decade. Eric was a name she hadn't thought about in years, but seeing his profile picture brought back a flood of memories. He was her first love, the boy who'd written her sappy love notes and played guitar in the school talent show just to impress her. She hesitated for a moment before hitting accept. What harm could it do? It was just an old friend, after all. It didn't take long for Eric to slide into her DMs. The conversation started innocently enough, catching up on life, reminiscing about the good old days. He mentioned how he'd moved to the city, started his own business, and, oh yeah, recently gone through a divorce. There was something about the way he phrased it, so casual yet vulnerable, that tugged at Rachel's heartstrings. Over the next few days, their chats became more frequent. Rachel found herself looking forward to his messages. The way he made her laugh and reminded her of a version of herself she'd almost forgotten. She didn't tell David about the conversations, not because she thought she was doing anything wrong, but because she didn't want to deal with the inevitable questions. One evening, as Rachel sat in bed scrolling through her messages, David walked in, towel slung over his shoulder from his post-shower routine. "Who are you texting?" he asked casually, but there was an edge to his voice that Rachel couldn't ignore. "Just an old friend from high school," she replied, keeping her tone light. "Remember Eric?" David nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, I remember. He was the one who used to follow you around like a lost puppy." Rachel forced a laugh, hoping to diffuse the tension. "Yeah, that's him." David didn't say anything else, but Rachel could feel his eyes on her as she turned off her phone and pretended to read a book. The air between them felt heavy, like a storm brewing on the horizon. The next week, Eric suggested they meet up for coffee. "Just to catch up in person," he said, like it was no big deal. Rachel hesitated, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She knew this was a bad idea, that meeting him would cross a line she couldn't uncross, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel drawn to him, like a moth to a flame. "Sure," she typed back, her heart pounding. "Let's do it." They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one she knew would run into her. Rachel told herself it was just coffee, nothing more. But as soon as she saw Eric with his easy smile and the faint scruff on his jawline, she felt a rush of emotions she hadn't felt in years. They talked for hours, laughing and sharing stories like no time had passed. Eric made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. He complimented her on things David never noticed, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her passions, the subtle streak of grey in her hair that she usually tried to hide. When they finally said goodbye, Rachel felt a pang of guilt. She told herself it was just a friendly meeting, but deep down, she knew there was more to it than that. Over the next few weeks, Rachel's relationship with Eric grew deeper. They texted constantly, and their messages became increasingly flirtatious. Rachel knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't seem to stop herself with Eric. She felt alive, like she was rediscovering a part of herself that had been buried under years of routine and compromise. David, meanwhile, started to notice the changes in Rachel. She seemed distracted, her phone always within arm's reach. Their conversations became shorter, their interactions more strained. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, David finally confronted her. "Is there something going on, Rachel?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Rachel's stomach dropped. She looked at him, her mind racing for an explanation. "What do you mean?" she asked, feigning innocence. "You've been different lately," David said, his eyes searching hers. "Distant, I feel like I'm losing you." Rachel opened her mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. The guilt that had been simmering beneath the surface threatened to boil over. She wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything and beg for forgiveness, but instead she shook her head and said, "I'm fine, David, really." But they both knew it was a lie. Rachel's guilt sat heavy on her chest, like a weight she couldn't shake off. Yet despite her better judgment, she found herself unable to cut ties with Eric. Their conversations became her escape, a place where she could be the version of herself she missed, carefree and desired. But with every text, every fleeting smile she shared with her phone screen, the chasm between her and David grew wider. One evening, as Rachel stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, she heard David's voice from behind her. "We need to talk," he said, his tone flat but resolute. Rachel's hands froze under the stream of water. She turned to face him, her stomach twisting into knots. "About what?" David leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I'm not stupid, Rachel. I know something's going on. If it's not with me, then who is it?" His words cut through her like a knife. Rachel wanted to deny it, to insist that he was imagining things, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't angry. He was hurt. And somehow, that was worse. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rachel said, her voice wavering. It was a weak defense, and they both knew it. David shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. "You think I don't notice the way you're always on your phone? The way you've been distant? You don't even look at me the same anymore." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to cry, to confess everything and beg for his forgiveness. But instead, she stood there in silence, unable to meet his gaze. For the first time in years, Rachel saw David as more than just the stoic, predictable man she married. She saw the vulnerability in him, the cracks in his armor. He wasn't just angry, he was scared of losing her. And as much as she wanted to pretend she didn't care, a part of her did. Meanwhile, Eric continued to weave his way into Rachel's life. He was charming, attentive, and everything David wasn't. But the more time Rachel spent with him, the more she began to notice the cracks in his facade. Eric had a way of making her feel like she was the center of his world, but there was a selfishness to his attention. He thrived on her need for validation, feeding off her insecurities like a moth drawn to a flame. It wasn't long before Rachel started to question whether Eric was truly the answer to her unhappiness or just a distraction from it. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon. Rachel had agreed to meet Eric at a secluded park, their secret spot, as he called it. As she sat on a weathered bench, waiting for him to arrive, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was probably just her paranoia, she told herself, but the feeling lingered. When Eric finally arrived, his usual easy smile seemed forced. "We need to talk," he said, echoing the words David had said just days earlier. Rachel frowned. "What's wrong?" Eric hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. "I think we're getting too comfortable," he said, his tone cautious. "You're married, Rachel. Whatever this is, it's not sustainable." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. "So, what are you saying, that we should stop seeing each other?" Eric ran a hand through his hair, looking conflicted. "I'm saying we need to be careful. I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart." Rachel stared at him, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to lash out, to accuse him of leading her on, but another part of her knew he was right. She had been reckless, chasing a fantasy that was never meant to last. As Eric walked away, leaving her alone on the bench, Rachel felt a wave of emotions she couldn't quite explain. Anger, sadness, relief, it all swirled together in a chaotic storm. For the first time, she began to question not just her relationship with Eric, but the choices that had led her to this point. When Rachel returned home that evening, she found David sitting on the porch, a beer in hand. He didn't say anything as she approached, but the silence between them spoke volumes. "I went for a walk," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, taking a sip of his beer. "Did it help?" Rachel hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I don't know." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The air between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken words. Finally, David broke the silence. "Rachel, I love you," he said, his voice cracking. "But I can't keep living like this. If you want to be with someone else, just tell me. I'd rather know the truth than keep guessing." Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to tell him everything, to lay her heart bare and hope he could forgive her. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat down beside him, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a stone. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but I know I don't want to lose you." And just like that, Rachel found herself at a crossroads. The life she had built with David was hanging by a thread, and the fantasy she had chased with Eric was starting to unravel. She knew she couldn't keep living in limbo, torn between two worlds, but the question remained: how do you choose between the comfort of what you know and the excitement of what you crave? Before we continue, I just want to take a moment to remind you all, if you're enjoying this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep creating content just like this. And don't forget to leave a comment below. What would you do if you were in Rachel's shoes? I'd love to hear your thoughts. The days that followed were filled with a constant undercurrent of tension. Rachel couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly at peace. Every conversation with David was laced with an unspoken question, and every message from Eric seemed to push her closer to a breaking point. She had become a woman torn between two worlds, each with its own set of expectations and desires, and it was starting to feel suffocating. One morning, after another quiet breakfast with David, Rachel decided to go for a walk. The air outside was thick with humidity, and the sky above seemed to mirror her turmoil, heavy with the promise of rain. As she strolled through the neighborhood, she found herself standing in front of the cafe where she had met Eric weeks ago. She hadn't expected to feel the pull to come back here, but the nostalgia hit her hard. The memories of their stolen moments together, the way he made her feel alive in a way David no longer did, were hard to ignore. Just as she turned to leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Eric. "Rachel, we need to talk. It's time." Her stomach dropped. She couldn't avoid it any longer. She had to make a decision. Should she keep playing the game, sneaking around, or should she finally confront her feelings and the truth about what she really wanted? That evening, Rachel sat in the living room, staring at the phone in her hand. She had been avoiding Eric's calls, but his words from earlier echoed in her mind. We need to talk. The truth was, she didn't want to face it. She didn't want to admit that she was the one who had been pulling away from David, the one who had let things get so complicated, but at the same time, she felt trapped. Eric had given her the excitement and validation she thought she needed, but David had given her stability, love, and a life they had built together. As she looked at David, sitting in the chair across from her, she saw how weary he looked, like he knew something was wrong but didn't know how to fix it. The connection between them had frayed over time, but it wasn't gone. She could still feel the love that had once been there, though it was buried under layers of resentment and uncertainty. "Rachel, talk to me," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "Please, I need to know what's going on." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had been avoiding this conversation for so long, but now, in the face of his vulnerability, she couldn't run anymore. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to tell him everything, but she didn't know how to untangle the mess she had made. David stood up, his face contorted with frustration. "I can't keep doing this, Rachel. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." Rachel felt a pang of guilt hit her like a wave, but she also knew, deep down, that she couldn't keep living this lie. As much as she cared for David, as much as she had once loved him, there was something missing, and it wasn't just the excitement that Eric had brought into her life. It was the feeling of being seen, understood, and desired in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The next day, Rachel agreed to meet Eric. They chose the same cafe where they'd first reconnected, the place that had come to symbolize everything she was questioning. She couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and dread as she drove there, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She knew this was it. She had to make a choice, and whatever happened, it would change everything. When Eric saw her walk through the door, he stood up immediately, his face softening into a smile. But there was an intensity in his eyes that Rachel couldn't ignore. He had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. "Rachel," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk about what happens next." She sat down, her heart pounding. This wasn't just about a fling anymore. It was about confronting everything she had been avoiding. The lies, the guilt, the decisions she had made. She had been looking for something in Eric, something to fill a void. But what if the void wasn't something that could be filled by someone else? "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," Rachel said, her voice cracking slightly. I thought maybe I needed you, but now I'm not so sure." Eric's face hardened, a look of frustration crossing his features. "So, what? You've had your fun and now you're going to walk away? That's how this ends?" Rachel flinched at his words. Had she really been treating it like that? It wasn't supposed to be a game, but in the end, wasn't that what it was? A distraction, a way to escape from a marriage she had grown tired of, without ever facing the reality of what that meant. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time, and something inside her snapped. "I'm sorry, Eric, I can't do this anymore." For a moment there was silence. Eric stared at her, his jaw clenched. Rachel could see the hurt in his eyes, but there was also something else, something she couldn't ignore. He wasn't the answer. "I think you need to go back to your husband," Eric said coldly, standing up. "You've got a lot to figure out, but don't drag me into it." Rachel stood, feeling a lump form in her throat. This wasn't how she had imagined things would end, but as she walked out of the cafe, she realized that it was exactly how things needed to end. She had let herself become so tangled up in this affair, so lost in the fantasy, that she had forgotten about the real life waiting for her at home. Rachel arrived home that evening, her mind racing with thoughts of the past few days, the lies, the decisions, the weight of everything she had put on hold. David was sitting on the porch, just like he had been the last time they talked. This time, though, there was a different look in his eyes, a mixture of concern and weariness, as though he knew what she was about to say. "I'm sorry," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've messed up. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm willing to try." David looked at her for a long time, and in that silence she felt the heaviness of all their unspoken words. Finally, he stood up, walking toward her. "Rachel, I don't know if I can forgive you, but I want to try. I think we both need to figure out who we are before we can figure out where we go from here. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and Rachel knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. The beginning of something new, perhaps not with Eric. Not with the fantasy, but with herself. This is where things start to get complicated, right? Rachel's journey is one of self-discovery and redemption, but there are still many layers to unravel. What do you think will happen next? Will David and Rachel manage to rebuild their trust? Or is this the beginning of the end? If you've been enjoying the story so far, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more updates. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. As the days passed, the tension between Rachel and David only deepened. The raw honesty they had shared that evening lingered in the air, but it wasn't enough to bridge the chasm that had formed between them. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was broken beyond repair, yet at the same time, there was still that flicker of hope, that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. But she wasn't sure if she even knew how to begin. She had been so consumed by her secret affair with Eric that she had lost sight of the core of her own marriage. It was a slow realization that hit her in waves. She wasn't just torn between two men, she was torn between who she had been and who she was becoming. David, for his part, seemed to have retreated inward. He no longer confronted Rachel with questions about Eric, no longer pressed her about her distance, but it was clear that the wound was festering. His quietness, the way he withdrew into his own space, hurt her more than any argument could have. The silence was louder than anything they could say to each other. Then, one night, Rachel woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing across the nightstand. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Eric. He had been sending texts sporadically, but this one was different. "I need to see you. It's important." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she read the message. There was something in the tone of his words that unsettled her. She knew she had ended things with him, had walked away from the tangled mess she had created, but something about his insistence made her uneasy. She had promised herself that Eric was a closed chapter, but was it really that easy to just move on? She sat in bed for a few minutes, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, torn between responding or ignoring him. Finally, she typed back. "Why now? What's changed?" Eric's reply came within seconds. "I don't want to lose you. Come meet me. Please." Rachel felt her stomach twist. This wasn't just about closure anymore. Eric wasn't giving up, and she wasn't sure if she wanted him to. The next evening, Rachel left the house after dinner, telling David she was going for a walk. It was a half-truth, and she knew it, but she didn't have the courage to tell him the whole story. Not yet. At least she slipped out of the house, driving to the same cafe where everything had started. She told herself she was only going to talk to Eric one last time, get some answers, and then move on for good. But when she arrived, she saw him sitting at a corner table, looking just as she remembered, casual but intense, his eyes locked onto hers the moment she entered. The old spark between them flickered, and for a brief second, Rachel felt a rush of excitement. "Rachel," Eric greeted her softly, standing as she approached. "Hi," she said, sitting down across from him. There was a strange tightness in her chest, but she forced herself to look calm. "What's going on, Eric? Why couldn't you just leave things as they were?" He hesitated, glancing away for a moment before speaking. "Because I can't," he said, his voice low. "I'm not ready to let you go, and I don't think you are either." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. She knew what he was saying. She wasn't ready to let go, not of him, not of the possibility of what they could have together. But she also knew deep down that this was a mistake. She had been looking for something in Eric that she hadn't found, something that was never going to be real. "You need to move on, Eric," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "I can't keep doing this to myself, to David. I can't keep living in two worlds." Eric's face darkened and he leaned forward. "You're still in love with me, Rachel. I can see it. Don't try to lie to me. This whole thing, whatever it is you have with David, it's not enough. You deserve more than that." The words stung. It was the truth, wasn't it? She didn't know if she was still in love with Eric, but there was something in her that craved the excitement he offered. That craving had clouded her judgment for so long, and now she was faced with the painful reality that it had all been an illusion. "You don't know me, Eric," she said, trying to control her emotions. "You don't know what I need, and I don't know what I need anymore." There was a long silence. Eric sat back in his chair, eyes narrowed, like he was deciding whether or not to push further. Then, with a soft sigh, he stood up. "I guess that's it then," he said, his voice distant. "You're making a mistake, Rachel, but I won't keep fighting for someone who isn't ready to fight for me." With those words, Eric turned and walked out of the cafe. Rachel sat there for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from her, feeling a strange emptiness settle in. She had been searching for validation, for excitement, for something that could fill the void inside her. But now, as she sat alone in the quiet cafe, she realized that none of it would ever be enough. She was the one who had to fill that void, not Eric, not David. Rachel returned home later that night, her mind reeling from her conversation with Eric. The weight of her decisions was heavier than ever, and she knew she couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. She couldn't keep living like this. She had to confront David and admit the truth. Everything had been building toward this moment, the moment when she would face the consequences of her actions. David was in the living room when she walked through the door, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her with those eyes that had once been filled with love, but now carried a weight of disappointment. "Rachel," he said quietly, "I've been thinking." She dropped her keys onto the counter, suddenly feeling very small. "About what?" "I know you've been seeing him," David said, his voice calm but laced with pain. "I know about Eric." Rachel's heart dropped. She didn't know how much David knew, but his words were like a knife twisting in her gut. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen." David stood up, walking toward her. His eyes searched hers for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to say what was on his mind. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Rachel, but I do know that I can't keep living like this, pretending everything's fine when it's not." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Please," she begged. "I want to fix this. I don't know how, but I want to try." David shook his head, turning away. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore. At this point it feels like everything's spiraling, doesn't it? Rachel's at a crossroads, and so is David. They've both been hurt by lies, by secrets, and now they have to figure out if they can rebuild their relationship from the broken pieces. What do you think will happen next? Will Rachel and David find a way to heal? Or is this the end of their journey together? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying this story. There's still so much more to come. As Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts spiraled, turning over everything she had said to David and everything she had failed to say. Her mind was still reeling from the conversation with Eric. She had thought it was over, thought she could walk away from it all and go back to her marriage. But the truth was, she was still stuck in limbo. She felt like she was holding two pieces of herself, one with David and one with Eric, and neither seemed like the right fit anymore. David's silence was deafening. The quiet between them had been growing since that evening when he admitted knowing about her affair. Every word, every glance they exchanged now felt weighted with guilt. Rachel had tried to explain, but it seemed like nothing she said could heal the rift she had caused. The trust was gone, and without trust, what was left? She stood up abruptly and paced around the room. She needed air, she needed space. There was no room in her house for the storm that was raging inside her, and the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. This was about her choices, about how far she was willing to go to rebuild what she had broken. David, for his part, was distant, though his body language screamed tension. The weight of what Rachel had done wasn't something he could easily shake off. She could feel it in every word he spoke, in every step he took around the house. They hadn't had a real conversation since that night, and Rachel felt like they were both waiting for the other to make the first move. Rachel had always known that David wasn't a man of many words. He kept his emotions hidden under the surface, so when he finally spoke, it felt like the moment everything had been building toward. He broke the silence when she walked back into the living room after a long walk around the block. "I'm not sure I can keep doing this," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've been thinking about what you said about how you wanted to try, but I don't know if we can go back to where we were, can we?" Rachel's heart slammed against her chest, the gravity of his words pulling her down. She wanted to answer him with certainty, to tell him that they could rebuild, but she didn't know if she believed that anymore. The love was there, yes, but so was the betrayal. She had broken something fundamental between them, and it wasn't going to be fixed with just a few more apologies. "I don't know," Rachel whispered, the tears finally coming. "I wish I could say everything will be okay, but I'm not sure it will be." David sighed and looked away, his jaw tightening. "I'm tired, Rachel. Tired of the uncertainty, tired of wondering if I'm enough for you." As the days passed, the distance between them grew. David began spending more time out of the house, working long hours in his landscaping business. Rachel could feel the absence of his presence in their home, the silence in the house growing heavier with each passing day. She had tried reaching out, tried to reconnect, but each attempt seemed to fall flat. She knew she had to make a choice, keep chasing the idea of what could have been with Eric, or fight for what she still had with David. The turning point came late one evening, when Rachel couldn't take the tension any longer. She found herself standing outside in the backyard, looking at the space they had created together, the flower beds that David had meticulously planted over the years, the garden benches where they'd shared quiet moments, the patio where they had once hosted barbecues and gatherings. Those things had been symbols of their life together, but now they seemed like reminders of everything that was slipping away. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Eric. "I'm not giving up on us, Rachel. I know you feel it too. Meet me tonight. We need to talk about what happens next." Rachel froze. She felt her heart rate spike. It was the moment she had been dreading, the moment she had to choose. She glanced toward the house where she knew David was likely inside, waiting for her to return, to face the truth. But the truth wasn't easy, and for the first time, Rachel realized that maybe it was time to stop running. Rachel stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, torn between two men and the lives they represented. She didn't want to hurt David any more than she already had. She didn't want to keep dragging him through the mess she had created, but she also didn't want to feel like she was suffocating in a life that no longer fit her. That night, she made the decision. She drove to the cafe where Eric had asked to meet. She told herself it would be the last time, that this would be the final conversation with him. But as she walked through the door and saw him sitting there, waiting for her with that same intensity in his eyes, she knew deep down that it wouldn't be easy to walk away. It never was with Eric. He had a way of making her feel like the center of his world, like everything was possible as long as they were together. But was that enough? Was it enough to leave behind the life she had built with David? "I came," she said, sitting down across from him. Eric's lips curled into a small smile. "I knew you would. I know you're still thinking about us." Rachel swallowed hard. "Eric, I've made my choice." His expression faltered for a moment. "What do you mean?" "I'm not coming back," Rachel said, her voice shaking but firm. "I can't keep living in this fantasy. I've been selfish, and I've hurt people who didn't deserve it." Eric leaned back in his chair, the smile fading from his face. "So that's it after everything?" Rachel nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I can't keep chasing something that isn't real. I've hurt David, and I need to try and fix that. I need to go home." For a moment, there was silence between them. Eric sat motionless, as if processing her words. Then, slowly, he stood up. "If that's what you want, Rachel, if that's the choice you're making, then I guess it's over." Rachel stood as well, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. She had done the right thing, but the weight of it still pressed heavily on her chest. She had said goodbye to Eric, but in doing so, she had also said goodbye to the version of herself that had been so caught up in the excitement of it all. Rachel drove home in silence, her mind racing with everything she had just done. She knew there was no going back now. The truth was out, and she had made her choice, but when she walked into the house and saw David sitting on the couch, his face weary but hopeful, it all felt like it could either break her or rebuild her. "David," she said softly, standing in the doorway. He looked up at her, his eyes searching. "Where did you go?" Rachel walked toward him slowly. "I went to see Eric," she said quietly. "And I told him the truth. I told him it's over." David's face tightened, but he didn't say anything. He just looked at her, waiting for more. And as she stood there, the enormity of everything she had done, everything she had risked, hit her like a wave. "I've made a mistake, David, but I want to try and fix this. I want to be with you, if you'll still have me." For the first time in weeks, David stood up and walked toward her. He didn't say anything right away, just reached for her hand. Rachel squeezed his hand tightly, feeling the weight of their shared history and the uncertainty of the future. The journey wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt like they might be able to rebuild. So, what do you think? Has Rachel made the right choice? Is there hope for her and David to rebuild their trust? Or is it too late? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And remember, if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The days after Rachel's decision to come clean to David felt like a whirlwind. She had made the choice, one that wasn't easy, but it was the right one. Walking away from Eric, finally choosing David, seemed like the step in the right direction, but Rachel couldn't help but feel that a part of her had already been lost. She couldn't undo the past, and no matter how much she wanted to turn back time, the truth remained. There was still that nagging question hanging over them. Could David ever forgive her? Could they rebuild the trust that had been shattered? David was different now. He had been quieter, more distant, but there was a tenderness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Every word they shared felt heavy, like they were both walking on eggshells. Rachel had tried to talk to him, tried to explain just how much she regretted everything. But David hadn't been ready to open up just yet. He was still processing, still deciding whether he could let go of the hurt she had caused. Rachel spent her days trying to be patient, waiting for the day when they could have a real conversation, one that didn't feel like they were just coexisting under the same roof, but the tension was suffocating. Their house, once a symbol of comfort and warmth, now felt like a cold battleground where both of them were fighting for something they weren't sure they could get back. One afternoon, as Rachel sat at the kitchen table, she heard the front door open. She stood up immediately, half expecting to see David walking through the door. But it wasn't him. It was Eric. Rachel froze as Eric stepped into the house, his face determined, eyes set with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. She didn't know why, but the sight of him in her home, uninvited, felt like a violation of the fragile peace she had been trying to hold on to. "What are you doing here?" Rachel asked, her voice shaky as she took a step back. Her body was tense, her heart racing. Eric didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. His gaze softened as he looked at her, but there was an edge to his expression, a quiet desperation that made Rachel's stomach tighten. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice calm, but there was an underlying urgency there. "You made a mistake, Rachel, and I think you know that, but you're still thinking about me, about us. I can see it in your eyes." Rachel shook her head, trying to steady herself. "No, Eric, I've made my choice. I've told you. This is over. Please leave." Eric stepped closer, his voice softening as he reached out toward her. "I'm not asking you to change your mind. I'm asking you to remember what we had and not throw it all away. You know this is the right decision for both of us." Rachel took a deep breath, feeling her pulse quicken. "I'm done with this," she said firmly. "You need to leave now." But Eric didn't move, his eyes locked onto hers, his hands outstretched as if he was trying to reach her. I know you're scared, Rachel, but you're not just running away from me. You're running away from yourself. You can't just go back to being the person you were before, and neither can I. Rachel felt a flood of emotions wash over her: confusion, anger, regret. But more than anything, there was fear. Fear that maybe Eric was right. Fear that she couldn't rebuild her life with David, that her decision to choose him was just another way of escaping the truth about who she had become. Before she could respond, the sound of the front door opening again cut through the air. This time, it was David. His eyes darted from Eric to Rachel, and in that instant, the tension in the room shifted. He stood there for a moment, silent, but his expression said everything. He knew. He knew that Rachel was still struggling, still questioning everything. Rachel's heart sank as she watched David's face tighten with disbelief. "Eric," David said, his voice low, "what are you doing here?" Eric turned to face David, and there was a coldness in his eyes as he met David's gaze. "I came to remind Rachel of what she's giving up, what she's too scared to admit." David's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. His eyes shifted back to Rachel, searching her face for answers. "Is this true, Rachel?" His voice cracked slightly, and Rachel could feel the weight of his hurt. I didn't want him here," Rachel said quickly, taking a step toward David. "I've told him it's over. I told him it was done, but—" David cut her off with a sharp gesture. "But what are you trying to say, Rachel?" Rachel swallowed hard, her eyes searching for the right words. She wasn't sure what to say. How could she explain to David that she was still torn? How could she tell him the truth about her feelings for Eric without ripping apart whatever small thread of hope they had left? "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know anymore. I thought I knew, but now—" David took a step back, shaking his head. "No, I can't do this." His voice was thick with emotion, and Rachel could see the pain in his eyes. "I'm done, Rachel. I can't keep doing this to myself. I'm tired of fighting for something that doesn't want to fight for me." In that moment, everything seemed to collapse around her. The reality of what she had done, the hurt, the lies, the choices she had made, was too much to bear. The man she loved, the man she had promised to share her life with, was standing in front of her, broken. And the truth was, she had broken him. Eric, seeing the storm brewing, backed away quietly, sensing that this wasn't the moment to push further. He gave Rachel a final, lingering look before turning toward the door. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. David didn't even acknowledge him as he left. His focus was solely on Rachel now, his eyes raw with a mixture of sorrow and anger. As soon as the door clicked shut behind Eric, David turned to her, his voice tight. "Rachel, I can't keep pretending like this isn't happening," David said. "You need to make a choice. You either want me or you don't. If you're still holding on to him, then I think we both know what this means." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment where everything she had been running from finally came to a head. She had to choose. There was no more room for uncertainty, no more room for lies. With her heart pounding in her chest, Rachel took a deep breath. "I want you, David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry I've hurt you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us." David's eyes searched hers for a long moment. He said nothing, but the quiet weight of his gaze told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't ready to forgive her yet, but maybe, just maybe, there was hope. What do you think is Rachel's choice enough to win back David's trust, and will David be able to let go of the pain she's caused? The story isn't over yet. Stay tuned for more. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing from you. The next few days were nothing short of excruciating for Rachel. She had made her choice, but the reality of it felt overwhelming. Every time she saw David, the look in his eyes reminded her of the depth of the hurt she had caused. She couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't hide behind empty promises or words that didn't carry weight. It was clear now that rebuilding wasn't just about saying the right things, it was about showing David through her actions that she was ready to make things right. David, however, was distant. He wasn't angry, but the hurt in his eyes told a different story. He had listened to her words, but Rachel could feel the walls closing in. His patience was wearing thin, and it wasn't just the affair he was struggling with. It was everything. The years of unspoken feelings, the disconnection that had slowly crept into their relationship. The betrayal had cut deeper than just the affair. It was everything that had been left unsaid for too long. Rachel spent her days trying to mend what she had broken, but it was like trying to rebuild a house with cracks in the foundation. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined she wasn't ready to give up on her marriage. Not yet. She could see the struggle in David's eyes too, the part of him that still loved her, still wanted to believe they could work through this. But that hope was fading, day by day. David's silence was suffocating. He wasn't giving up, but he was pulling away. Rachel could feel the growing divide between them. He no longer asked about her day, no longer shared little moments of connection. Instead, he focused on work, on distractions that kept him busy enough to avoid dealing with the pain. And Rachel, for her part, was doing everything she could to bridge that gap. She tried talking to him about their future, about rebuilding, but his responses were always cautious, hesitant. One evening, Rachel decided to do something different. She knew that simply talking wasn't enough. Words weren't going to fix this. She needed to show David that she wasn't just saying the right things, she was living them, so she spent the evening preparing a dinner, something simple but heartfelt. She hoped that in this small act, she could create a moment for them to reconnect. She wanted to remind David of the life they had before everything fell apart. As she set the table, she noticed David standing in the doorway watching her. His face was unreadable, but Rachel saw the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "You made dinner?" he asked, his tone surprised but not unkind. "I thought we could eat together." "Talk," Rachel said softly. Setting down the last plate, she gestured for him to sit. "I know it's been hard, but I want to try. I'm trying, David." David hesitated for a moment, then sat down, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the table. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest as she waited for him to speak, wondering if this would be the moment when everything finally started to shift, or if it would all crumble. After a long silence, David finally looked up at her, his eyes intense. "What are we doing, Rachel? What do you want from me?" Rachel swallowed hard, the weight of his question bearing down on her. "I want us to try. I want to rebuild what we've lost. I can't promise it will be easy, but I'm willing to put in the work. I want you, David. I want our life together. I need you to let me in again." David stared at her, his face unreadable. He didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. Then finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I don't know if I can, Rachel. I don't know if I can ever forget what you did. I don't know if I can trust you again." Rachel's heart sank, and she felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She knew he was right. He couldn't just forget. He couldn't just move on from the betrayal as if nothing had happened. The damage was done, and it wasn't something that could be erased with a few apologies. But as she looked at him, she realized something. She wasn't asking for him to forget. She was asking for him to give her a chance to prove that she was still the woman he had married, the woman who was capable of loving him with everything she had. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. "I'm not asking you to forget, David. I'm asking you to remember why we fell in love in the first place," Rachel said quietly. "I know it's going to take time, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." David took a deep breath and looked away, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I don't know, Rachel. I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I did before." Rachel's heart shattered at his words, but she didn't give up. She didn't run. "I can't make you trust me, David. I can only show you that I'm worth trusting, and I will. I'll prove it every single day." Later that evening, Rachel found herself walking through the house, her thoughts clouded with doubt. Had she done enough? Was this really going to work? Could she truly rebuild their relationship after everything? The weight of the questions loomed over her, but one thing was certain. She couldn't walk away. She couldn't give up on them, not without a fight. Just as she was about to retreat to her room, she heard David's voice from behind her. "Rachel." She turned around, her heart pounding. David stood in the hallway, his eyes softening as they met hers. He had his hands shoved into his pockets, but there was a vulnerability in his posture that caught her off guard. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," David said, his voice quieter now. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give you another chance." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded slowly, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know where this will go, but I'm willing to take that first step with you. We'll figure it out together." Rachel felt the weight lift off her chest, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. They were far from where they had once been, but it was a start, a small start, but a start nonetheless. "So, what do you think? Will Rachel and David be able to find their way back to each other? Or is the damage too deep to heal?" Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're loving this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We've got more twists and turns ahead. The days following David's reluctant agreement to give their marriage another chance were filled with tension, but also something else. Small, tentative signs of hope. Rachel poured herself into trying to rebuild what she had almost destroyed. Focusing on the little things, she made dinner more often. She started to share her day with David. She sent him messages when he was out working, reminding him that she was still there, trying. But despite her efforts, the gap between them remained wide, and Rachel couldn't help but feel the pressure mounting with each passing day. David's walls were still up, and though he didn't push her away completely, there was a coldness to his responses. His eyes no longer lit up when she walked into a room, and when they did talk, it was brief, businesslike, as if they were co-workers trying to get through the day. There were moments when Rachel thought she saw a flicker of the old David, the man who once swept her off her feet with a smile or a touch, but those moments were fleeting, and they only made the silence between them more painful. Despite everything, Rachel was determined. She wasn't ready to walk away, and she didn't think David was either. They just needed time. But the problem with time is that it doesn't always heal. Sometimes it just creates more space for doubt, and that's exactly what Rachel was starting to feel. She had spent so many years running from her own feelings, from the parts of her marriage that made her uncomfortable. She had built a life that, on the surface, seemed perfect, but beneath the facade, she had ignored the cracks, until one day, those cracks had split wide open. She had been so focused on seeking excitement, on finding something that would make her feel alive again, that she had forgotten what truly mattered: David, their life together. And now, she wasn't sure if she could make it right. Not with just words, and certainly not with gestures like making dinner. As Rachel sat in the living room that evening, she glanced over at David. He was sitting in his usual spot on the couch, eyes glued to his phone, seemingly lost in whatever work or distraction had his attention that night. There was a heaviness in the room, a weight that seemed to press down on both of them. Rachel had done everything she could think of to get through to him. She had apologized, she had shown him her commitment, but nothing seemed to change. "David," she said quietly, breaking the silence that had hung over them for the past few hours. He looked up at her slowly, his gaze unreadable. "I know this isn't easy," Rachel continued, her voice thick with emotion. "But I need you to know that I'm here. I'm trying every day to make this right." David didn't respond immediately, and Rachel could feel the tension in her chest tighten. The way he looked at her, almost like he was studying her, made her uneasy. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, measured. "Rachel, I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. You've broken my trust, and I don't know how to rebuild that." The words hit her like a slap. Rachel felt a sharp pain in her chest, but she didn't back down. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm asking you to give me a chance. We can't fix everything in a day, but I believe we can fix it if we both try, if you'll try." David sighed and rubbed his hand over his face, his frustration palpable. "I don't know if I can, Rachel. You've hurt me so much I don't even know if I can look at you the same way." Rachel's heart broke hearing him say those words. She knew she had shattered his trust, and now it felt like the consequences of that were finally settling in. But she couldn't stop now. She wasn't going to let him walk away without trying. "I'm sorry, David," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I know I've hurt you, I can't undo the past, but I swear to you, I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. Please don't give up on us." There was a long silence as David stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Rachel thought he might get up and walk away, that this was it, that their marriage was beyond saving. But instead, he stood up and walked toward the window, staring out into the night. "I don't know what to do," he said quietly, his voice distant. "I want to believe you, Rachel. I want to trust you again, but it's hard. I don't know if I can ever forget what you did." Rachel felt a deep pit in her stomach as she heard David's words. There was no easy way out of this, no quick fix. They were at a crossroads, and it was up to both of them to decide whether they would keep going or if this would be the end of their journey together. But as she watched David standing by the window, she realized something. She wasn't asking for forgiveness because she thought it was owed to her. She wasn't asking for a clean slate. What she was asking for was the chance to prove herself, the chance to show him that she was still capable of loving him in the way he deserved. It wasn't going to be easy, but she wasn't about to give up without a fight. "David," she said softly, stepping toward him, "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to trust me again, to take a step with me into the unknown. I know I've hurt you, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." David turned around slowly, his eyes searching hers. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. And then finally he spoke. "I don't know what's going to happen between us, Rachel," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where this goes. But you have to understand, it's not just about you proving something to me. I need to heal too, and that's going to take time." Rachel felt a small surge of hope, but it was tempered by the reality of what David had just said. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start, and that was all she could ask for. The next few weeks were filled with awkward conversations and tentative steps forward. David was still distant, but he was no longer as cold. He began to let Rachel back in, bit by bit, though the trust he had once given her was still guarded, still fragile. Rachel could feel the weight of his pain in every touch, every hesitant word, but she didn't give up. One evening, as they sat on the couch together, the tension between them felt less suffocating. Rachel had made them dinner again, and they ate in silence, the food tasting a little bit better than it had in the weeks before. It wasn't perfect, but it was something Rachel had learned, that love wasn't always about grand gestures. It was in the quiet moments, the small acts of kindness that said, "I'm here, I'm not leaving." David spoke after a long silence. "I don't know if we can ever go back to how things were before, Rachel, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not supposed to go back. Maybe we just have to find a new way forward." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to find a new way forward with you." David looked at her, his expression softening. "I'm not saying it will be easy, but if we're going to do this, we need to be honest with each other. No more secrets." Rachel nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "No more secrets, I promise." And so Rachel and David begin their journey of rebuilding, one small step at a time. It's not going to be easy, but they're both willing to fight for what they have. What do you think? Will they find their way back to each other? Or is it too late for them? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're loving this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We've still got more twists ahead. As the weeks passed, the walls that had once separated Rachel and David began to crack, slowly giving way to something more genuine, something that felt real again. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. There were still awkward silences, lingering doubts, and unspoken pain between them, but there was also a flicker of hope, a shared willingness to rebuild. Rachel knew that she couldn't erase the past, and she had no illusions about the road ahead. Trust, once broken, was never easily repaired, but she had seen David make an effort. He started to ask about her day again, to open up, even in small ways. Their conversations were still guarded, but there was a sincerity to them now that hadn't been there in the aftermath of the affair. David wasn't ready to forgive her fully, but he was willing to try, and that was more than Rachel had ever expected, and that was enough to keep going, to keep fighting for them. But the turning point came on a quiet Saturday evening, as they sat on the porch together, the sun dipping below the horizon. Rachel looked over at David, who was sitting next to her, his elbow resting on the arm of the chair, eyes focused on the fading light. There was a sense of peace between them now, something that had been absent for so long. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from ignoring the past. It was the kind that came from facing it, from being willing to move forward despite everything that had happened. Rachel didn't know how long they sat there, just watching the sky change colors. But eventually, David turned to her and spoke. "You were right," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "We don't need to go back. Maybe we're not supposed to go back to how things were, but I think we can move forward together." Rachel felt a lump in her throat, and she reached out to take his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I don't know what the future holds, David, but I know I'm willing to fight for it, for you, for us." David looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words, as if making sure he wasn't just hearing what he wanted to hear. But then, to her surprise, he smiled, a small, genuine smile. It wasn't the same as the carefree smiles they had shared years ago, but it was a start. "Me too," he said. "Me too." As the months went by, Rachel began to realize just how much she had changed. The person she had been before the affair, the person who had sought excitement, who had run from her own unhappiness, was no longer who she wanted to be. The lessons she had learned through the pain, the mistakes, and the difficult decisions were profound. She had learned that happiness wasn't something that could be chased, it was something that had to be nurtured, that had to come from within. And she had learned that the love she had with David was worth fighting for, even if it meant facing the toughest truths about herself. David, too, had changed. His own journey had been one of healing, of learning to trust again, to let go of the anger that had consumed him in the aftermath of Rachel's betrayal. The process had been slow, and there had been setbacks, but there had also been moments of growth. David had learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, it meant moving forward, even when the pain still lingered, and he had learned that love wasn't just about passion and excitement, it was about choosing each other every day, even when things weren't easy. Together, they had found something new, not the same relationship they had before, but something deeper, something more real. They had learned to communicate, to share their fears and their hopes, and to support each other through the hardest times. They still had work to do, and the scars of the past would never fully disappear, but they had begun to rebuild something that felt solid again. It was a year later when Rachel and David sat in the same spot on the porch, just as they had all those months ago. The sun was setting once more, casting a golden light over the yard, but this time the air between them felt different, lighter, freer. They were no longer haunted by the past in the same way. The silence between them wasn't filled with tension anymore. It was filled with understanding. "I never thought we'd get here," Rachel said, her voice soft but steady. David turned to her, a knowing look in his eyes. "Me neither," he admitted. "But I'm glad we did." Rachel smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Me too," she whispered. "I think we're finally starting to heal." And in that moment, Rachel realized that the journey wasn't over, that healing was an ongoing process, one that would take time and effort, but they had come so far, and there was still so much more to build together. They didn't need to be perfect. They didn't need to have all the answers. All they needed was each other, and the willingness to face whatever came next, side by side. As the sky darkened, Rachel rested her head on David's shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. They had been through the storm, and now they were learning to live in the calm. And so, we come to the end of Rachel and David's journey, a story of betrayal, heartbreak, growth, and ultimately, healing. It wasn't an easy road for either of them, but they found their way back to each other, one small step at a time. This story serves as a reminder that love isn't perfect. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes it takes us through some difficult places. But if we're willing to put in the work, to face the hard truths, and to forgive ourselves and others, we can find our way back to what truly matters. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. For more stories like this, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Rachel and David's journey in the comments below. Do you think they'll be able to keep moving forward, or is their past still too much to overcome? Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you soon. Remember, life is full of twists and turns, but the most important thing is to keep moving forward, no matter what.